Amy and Daniel Hargrave seemed like polar opposites. She was the glamorous, internationally adored model at the height of her fame, while he was the quiet, overlooked younger brother, drowning in jealousy and resentment. But behind their contrasting lives, a deadly secret was brewing. One night, the envy that had festered for years would erupt in violence, and Amy would become the first victim in a shocking crime that no one saw coming. The Hargrave family appeared to be living the American dream. James and Laura, both successful in their respective careers, had built a life many would envy. James, a respected lawyer, and Laura, a talented architect, had worked tirelessly to provide for their two children, Amy and Daniel. The family lived in a sprawling modern home on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by lush gardens and an air of quiet affluence. It was the kind of home that looked perfect from the outside, a true reflection of a life carefully curated and maintained. Amy, the eldest of the two children, was the jewel of the Hargrave family. At 22, she had already carved out a name for herself in the fashion world. Her face graced the covers of high-end magazines, and she was frequently spotted at prestigious events, walking the runways in Paris, Milan, and New York. Amy's beauty was captivating, and her charm made her a favorite among designers, photographers, and fans alike. It seemed that everything in her life came effortlessly. She was beautiful, talented, and adored by all who met her. To her parents, Amy was the success story they could brag about, proof that their hard work had paid off. In contrast, Daniel, her younger brother, was often overlooked. At 18, he was quiet, introverted, and prone to staying in the background, especially in the shadow of his sister's fame. He had never been the golden child. Daniel was not as athletic as some of his classmates, nor was he particularly social. He spent most of his time alone, either in his room reading or playing video games. Though academically gifted, he never seemed to care much for the accolades or attention that came with it. His parents, though loving, were often too busy with their own careers to pay much attention to the changes taking place in their son. While Amy thrived under the bright lights of the fashion world, Daniel struggled with his identity. He admired his sister in some ways, but also resented her. The constant praise she received made him feel invisible, as though he was living in the shadow of someone far more important. The tension between them grew, even though they rarely fought openly. Amy's success only deepened Daniel's feelings of inadequacy. At family gatherings, his parents would talk about Amy's next big shoot or runway show, while Daniel would quietly sit on the sidelines, his feelings of loneliness and frustration festering in silence. He never felt seen, never felt special. His name was hardly ever mentioned in their conversations, and his achievements were rarely celebrated. But this distance between them was not merely about rivalry or jealousy. It was something deeper, something darker. Daniel's internal struggle went unnoticed by his parents, who were consumed by their own lives. Amy, for all her success, was too wrapped up in her career to pay much attention to her younger brother. She lived in a world of luxury and excitement, while Daniel remained stuck in a quiet, private battle with his own feelings of worthlessness. The more Amy succeeded, the more Daniel retreated into himself, and the more the seed of resentment grew. To outsiders, the Hargraves looked like the perfect family, happy, successful, and seemingly free of any serious problems. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. What the world didn't know was that the quiet, overlooked brother was harboring a dangerous jealousy, one that would soon turn into something far more sinister. It was late on a Thursday evening in the fall when everything changed. The house on the outskirts of the city was still and quiet, the only sound coming from the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of leaves outside as the wind picked up. Amy had just returned from a photo shoot in the city, tired but exhilarated. Her work had been getting more and more attention, and that evening had been no different. The photographers had praised her poise, the designers had complimented her figure, and her social media was filled with messages from fans. For Amy, it was another night to add to the long list of successes. She entered through the front door, dropping her heavy bag by the coat rack and sighing in relief as she removed her high heels. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of the hallway light, which illuminated the polished hardwood floors. Her parents had gone out to dinner with friends, leaving Amy alone for the evening. Her brother Daniel was nowhere to be seen. She called out softly, but there was no answer. She had learned to expect little from Daniel. As usual, he was probably holed up in his room, lost in his own world. They hadn't spoken much in recent weeks, and that suited Amy just fine. She didn't think much about him, not in any personal way. Amy headed upstairs to her room, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She placed her phone on the bedside table and walked to her closet to change out of the clothes she had worn for the shoot. She was looking forward to a quiet evening. Maybe she would scroll through social media, chat with a few friends, and then unwind with a movie before bed. But just as she was about to settle in, she heard a noise. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Amy froze. It wasn't a sound she recognized. The house was supposed to be empty. She thought it could have been the house settling, an old creak, or even the wind playing tricks with the windows, but something inside her told her otherwise. Still, she shrugged it off. Amy had always been a little jumpy, a little prone to imagining things, especially when she was tired. She glanced at her phone, considering calling her parents to let them know she was home, but something stopped her. Maybe it was that strange feeling in the air, or maybe it was the nagging thought that Daniel had been acting odd lately, more withdrawn than usual. But she didn't want to dwell on it. She turned off the light and lay down on her bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. The noise had faded, and everything seemed peaceful once more. That was when she heard the sound again, this time louder, closer, like someone had stumbled down the stairs. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an old house creak. Someone was in the house. Panic set in. Amy quickly got out of bed, tiptoeing toward the door to listen. She couldn't hear anything now, and for a moment she thought she had imagined it. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. She crept to the stairs and peered down into the dim hallway below. The faint glow of the hallway light illuminated the stairway, but nothing seemed amiss. No one was there. Her pulse raced, and she considered calling the police, but then she paused. Could it be Daniel? Had he decided to come out of his room for once? Maybe he had gotten upset over something trivial again. Still, the unsettling feeling in her chest refused to fade. Before she could make a decision, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and coming up the stairs. The noise was closer now, unmistakable. Her heart began to pound in her chest. Her instinct screamed that something was wrong, that she was no longer alone in the house. But she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, frozen in a moment of fear. Then, as quickly as it had started, the house went silent. There was no more sound, no more movement. The quiet hung thick in the air, suffocating her. Amy's thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her mind jumped from one possibility to the next, but none of them seemed to make sense. Why was Daniel behaving so strangely lately? Why had he disappeared so suddenly? A feeling of dread settled over her as she stepped cautiously into the hallway, the stillness of the house pressing down on her. As she descended the stairs, she could feel the weight of the night pressing in. The air was colder than usual, the shadows seemed darker, and she knew in the pit of her stomach that she was about to face something she could never have anticipated. What happened next? No one could have predicted. The morning after Amy's death, the police arrived at the Hargrave residence, greeted by an eerie silence. The grand house, once a symbol of success and harmony, now felt suffocatingly empty. The investigators began their work, documenting the scene, photographing every corner of the room, and meticulously searching for clues. Amy's lifeless body had been discovered at the foot of the stairs, her face frozen in a look of horror, her neck bruised from a violent struggle. The sight was haunting, and the authorities knew they were dealing with something far more sinister than a simple accident. At first, the investigation was slow, with few leads to follow. There was no sign of forced entry, no indications of robbery, and nothing in the house seemed disturbed aside from Amy's tragic fall. The investigators combed through her personal life, her career, and her social media accounts, trying to piece together a motive. Amy had a growing number of enemies in the fashion world: jealous colleagues, overzealous fans, or even disgruntled ex-boyfriends, but there was no clear suspect. And yet, one thing became increasingly clear: the Hargrave family was hiding something. While James and Laura Hargrave were devastated by the loss of their daughter, their grief seemed overshadowed by their concern for their son, Daniel. From the moment the authorities arrived, Daniel's behavior struck the detectives as unusual. He had been the one to find Amy's body, but his reaction was far from what one would expect from a young man who had just discovered his sister's brutal murder. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he answered the initial questions. He said he had been in his room the entire night, playing video games and unaware of what had happened until the morning. When the police asked about his relationship with Amy, Daniel's responses were strangely indifferent. He said that they hadn't been particularly close recently, that she was busy with her modeling career, and that he spent most of his time alone. There was no mention of any deeper emotional connection, nor any signs of distress over her death. In fact, Daniel seemed almost too calm for someone who had just experienced the loss of his older sister. The investigators dug deeper, hoping to find something that would explain his strange demeanor. They discovered that Daniel had a history of anger issues, though nothing severe enough to have drawn attention. Teachers and classmates recalled instances when he had lashed out in frustration, often breaking things in fits of rage. He had been a quiet, lonely child, often teased by his peers, but there had never been any indication that his behavior would escalate to violence, let alone murder. But the deeper the police went into Daniel's life, the more unsettling details emerged. They found his private social media account, one that he kept hidden from his family, where he had been obsessively following Amy's career. Under fake names, he had left angry, bitter comments about her success, claiming that she was the family's favorite and that she had stolen everything from him. His online posts were filled with venom, accusing her of being selfish and of overshadowing his achievements. In one post, he had written that he felt invisible, that no one cared about him, and that Amy's fame was a constant reminder of his failure. Even more disturbing were the journal entries discovered on his computer. Daniel had been documenting his feelings of resentment and jealousy toward Amy for months. He had written about how he could never live up to the expectations set by his family, and how he had come to see his sister's success as the root of all his pain. His jealousy was not just about fame, it was about the attention and love that Amy had taken from him, and the life he felt he would never have. But it was a message he had sent to an anonymous online forum that was the most chilling. The message read, "I've had enough of being the nobody. She'll never be the perfect daughter again. I'll make sure of it." It was a harrowing glimpse into Daniel's mind, a dark and twisted desire to rid himself of the shadow his sister cast over his life. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became Daniel had been harboring deep, dangerous feelings for a long time. His jealousy had festered into hatred, and his resentment had turned into something much darker. But the real question was, had Daniel been planning this all along? Was the murder of his sister a spontaneous act driven by a moment of rage, or had he been methodically working up to it? As the police closed in on Daniel, they found a growing sense of unease in his family's responses. His parents, though devastated by the loss, were reluctant to believe that their son could be capable of such violence. Laura, in particular, seemed to cling to the idea that Daniel was simply misunderstood, that he was troubled but not dangerous. Yet the evidence was mounting. Daniel's strange behavior, his obsession with Amy's career, and his unsettling online presence were all pieces of a much darker puzzle. Daniel was arrested soon after the discovery of the journal entries and online posts. But even as the police led him away in handcuffs, there was no sign of guilt, no tears, no remorse in his eyes. He seemed detached, almost as if the reality of his sister's death hadn't fully sunk in. His expression remained cold, empty, as if the entire situation was a mere inconvenience in his mind, a final, tragic chapter in the story of the overlooked younger brother who had never been given the chance to shine. As the investigation into Amy's murder continued, the police focused all their attention on Daniel. Despite his odd and emotionless reaction to his sister's death, his alibi that claimed that he had been playing video games in his room all night had initially seemed plausible. However, as detectives delved deeper into the details, they began to notice inconsistencies in his story. The hours between the time Amy returned home and when the police were called were vague, and Daniel's calm demeanor raised more questions than answers. The breakthrough came when the investigators searched Daniel's room. They discovered a series of disturbing items that painted a clearer picture of his mental state. His computer, which he had carefully kept locked away, contained a cache of unsettling documents, journal entries, posts on online forums, and photos of Amy, many taken from a distance during her modeling shoots. There were also several graphic drawings of Amy, some of which depicted violent imagery. Daniel had been secretly documenting his fantasies, obsessing over the idea of removing the person who had stolen the spotlight in their family. The journals were particularly telling. In one entry, Daniel wrote about how his sister had everything he ever wanted: beauty, success, the admiration of their parents, and the affection of their friends. He described how he had tried to gain their attention through his own achievements, but no matter what he did, it was never enough. Amy's name was always the one that was mentioned in the newspapers, at family gatherings, and in the conversations of their parents. His frustration had turned into resentment, and resentment had morphed into something more dangerous. Perhaps the most chilling part of the investigation came when the detectives uncovered a draft of a plan. The document outlined, in disturbing detail, how Daniel intended to kill his sister. He had planned to wait until their parents were out, knowing Amy would be alone at the house. He had carefully studied her routine, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the days leading up to the murder, he had been practicing the method of strangulation, convinced that it would be the perfect way to silence her forever. It was clear now this was not a crime of passion, but one of cold, calculated intent. Daniel had been planning the murder for weeks, maybe even months. The authorities were horrified, but the details of the plan didn't explain the complete absence of guilt or emotion Daniel showed during his interactions with them. After his arrest, he was brought in for questioning, but the young man remained remarkably calm. He spoke about his sister in an almost clinical manner, describing her as an obstacle that had to be removed. There was no tearful outburst, no signs of remorse, only the cold, detached manner of someone who seemed to view the entire situation as a necessary step in his own personal journey. It wasn't until the interrogations grew more intense that Daniel finally confessed to the murder. But even then, there was no emotional breakdown, no flood of regret. He told the detectives exactly what had happened, detailing how he had waited for Amy to come home that night, then lured her into the hallway before attacking. The struggle, he said, had been brief but violent. He had not hesitated, he had simply acted on the years of anger and resentment that had built up inside him. As he recounted the events, Daniel's face remained impassive. There was no fear, no guilt in his eyes, only the cold, unfeeling gaze of someone who seemed to have detached themselves entirely from the act they had just committed. His lack of remorse shocked the investigators. It was as though he saw himself as a victim, someone who had been wronged by a sister who had outshone him in every way possible. In his mind, he was justified. Amy's death was the only way he could reclaim his life, a life that had been overshadowed by her success for far too long. The confession sent shockwaves through the community. To the outside world, the Hargrave family had appeared perfect, successful, wealthy, and seemingly without a care in the world. But the darkness within Daniel had been hiding in plain sight, unnoticed until it was too late. His carefully constructed facade of the quiet, misunderstood younger brother had concealed a dangerous, volatile mind, one capable of incredible violence when pushed to the edge. As Daniel was escorted from the interrogation room, his demeanor never wavered. He looked almost relieved, as though the weight of the secret he had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. To him, Amy was no longer an obstacle, no longer a source of his pain. But for the Hargrave family, there was no closure. There was only the unbearable grief of a life lost, the haunting realization that the very person they had trusted and loved was capable of such horror. The trial would follow soon after, but for now the investigators could only stare at the young man who had once been their own flesh and blood, who had been so cold, so calculating, and yet so completely devoid of the emotions that one might expect from a brother who had just murdered his sister. And as the truth slowly came to light, one thing became painfully clear: the boy who had always been overshadowed by his sister was not the innocent victim he had made himself out to be. He was something far more dangerous. The trial of Daniel Hargrave was an event that captivated the nation. The once celebrated family, who had always seemed so perfect, was now at the center of a media storm. James and Laura, devastated by the loss of their daughter, and now forced to come to terms with the horrifying truth about their son, were thrust into the public eye. The couple, who had always been known for their professionalism and elegance, were now seen as the parents of a murderer, their lives shattered by the very person they had loved and raised. Daniel's trial was highly publicized, and the courtroom became a stage for a battle that was as much about family secrets as it was about justice. For weeks, the prosecution presented the evidence: the journals, the disturbing online posts, and the chilling confession Daniel had made to the police. They painted a picture of a young man consumed by jealousy and resentment toward his sister. He had planned her murder in meticulous detail, believing that her death would somehow free him from the suffocating shadow she cast over his life. The prosecution argued that Daniel had killed his sister not in a moment of rage, but with cold, premeditated intent, driven by years of feeling overlooked and inferior. On the other side, Daniel's defense team painted a different picture. They acknowledged his violent tendencies, but claimed that his actions were the result of severe mental illness. Daniel had been struggling with depression and feelings of deep isolation for years, they argued. His parents had been too focused on Amy's career to notice the growing darkness inside their son. The defense team claimed that Daniel was not fully in control of his actions, and that he had not understood the full consequences of what he was doing. They called upon expert witnesses who testified that Daniel's obsession with Amy was rooted in untreated mental health issues, and they begged the jury to consider a reduced sentence based on his mental state at the time of the crime. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Daniel's demeanor was playing a significant role in the proceedings. He showed no signs of remorse, no tears, no expressions of guilt, just the same detached, emotionless persona he had displayed throughout the investigation. His cold, almost robotic responses to the testimony were unsettling to those who had followed the case. The contrast between Daniel's behavior in court and the emotional pleas from his parents, who sat in the audience each day with tears in their eyes, only highlighted the horror of the situation. James and Laura appeared broken, unable to comprehend how their son could be capable of such an unspeakable act. The most gut-wrenching moment came when the prosecutor asked James and Laura to testify. They spoke of their love for both of their children, how they had tried their best to raise them in a loving home. They described Amy's gentle nature and her infectious laughter, how proud they had been of her success in the fashion world. Then, with tears streaming down their faces, they spoke of the shock and disbelief they felt when they learned the truth about Daniel. How could their son, the quiet boy they had always thought of as misunderstood, be the one to take his sister's life? How could the child they had raised with love and care be capable of such monstrous violence? Their pain was palpable, and it was impossible for anyone in the courtroom to remain unaffected by their grief. The defense, meanwhile, tried to present Daniel as a victim of circumstance. They argued that his childhood had been one of neglect, that his parents' focus on Amy's career had left Daniel to fend for himself emotionally. They painted him as a troubled young man who had never received the help he so desperately needed. But the jury, while sympathetic to his mental health struggles, could not ignore the coldness with which Daniel had carried out the murder. The fact that he had planned it for weeks, the meticulous preparation, the lack of remorse, it was all too much for them to overlook. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Daniel Hargrave was convicted of first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the judge announced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a harsh sentence, but in the eyes of many, it was the only fitting punishment for a crime so horrific. In the aftermath of the trial, the Hargrave family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. James and Laura, unable to reconcile the son they had loved with the monster he had become, withdrew from the public eye. They retreated into their grief, unable to fully comprehend the betrayal they had experienced at the hands of their own flesh and blood. Daniel's conviction marked the end of a chapter, but it did little to ease the pain that lingered. Amy was gone, her life cruelly stolen away by the very person who should have been her protector. And Daniel, though he was locked away behind bars, remained a symbol of the deep and dangerous consequences of untreated mental illness, unchecked jealousy, and the profound emotional scars that can fester in the darkest corners of the human mind. The tragedy of the Hargrave family served as a chilling reminder of how fragile the line is between love and resentment, between success and destruction. For the Hargraves, there would be no easy answers, no simple resolutions. The darkness that had taken root in their son had claimed not only Amy's life but their own sense of safety, love, and security. The perfect family was no more.